Winter sunlight spilled across the American plains, pale and cold but not cruel. A train groaned to a halt near a fenced compound outside a quiet Midwestern town. It was 1944, nearly 5,000 miles from the war raging across Europe. The men who stepped down from the cars wore tattered field coats marked with faded eagles and swastikas. Exhausted, hollow-eyed, still smelling of the Atlantic salt, these were captured soldiers of Hitler's army, shipped across the ocean under armed guard, expecting punishment, humiliation, perhaps even starvation. But what they found was something else entirely. A young American sentry handed the first man a steaming tin cup coffee, strong and sweet. Another offered a cigarette, lighting it without a word. At a nearby tent, an older guard unpacked a crate of chocolate bars, tossing them to the prisoners like they were baseballs at a fair. The Germans froze, unsure if it was a cruel trick. Then one laughed nervously. Another wept. The air filled with smoke and disbelief. They had been defeated in battle, yet somehow treated with dignity. This was their first lesson on American soil. A different kind of victory, one that didn't need a rifle. By 1943, the tide of war had begun to shift. The Desert Campaign in North Africa was over. Tens of thousands of German and Italian soldiers, veterans of Rommel's Africa Corps, had laid down their arms. The Allies suddenly faced a problem they hadn't planned for: what to do with so many prisoners of war. Europe was already bursting with camps, and Britain's limited space and food supply couldn't handle the influx. The United States, with its vast land and resources, agreed to take them. Soon American ships began crossing the Atlantic, not just with troops and tanks, but with captured enemies. By the end of the war, more than 425,000 Axis prisoners, most of them German, would be held in the United States. It was one of the largest prisoner movements in modern history. They came from many fronts: North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, even the U-boat crews captured in the Atlantic. The journey was long and tense. The men were packed into transport ships under heavy guard, uncertain whether they would even survive the trip. Propaganda had told them Americans were brutal, that capture meant death or torture. Instead, when they disembarked in New York, Boston, or New Orleans, they were processed, fed, and even medically examined before being sent inland. Most ended up in remote camps across the Midwest and South: Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Iowa, and Georgia. The logic was simple. Far from the coasts, escape was nearly impossible, and communities there had the space. These camps were built quickly but efficiently: rows of wooden barracks, watchtowers, barbed wire fences, and mess halls. The climate was harsh in places, but the rules were clear. The prisoners would be treated according to the 1929 Geneva Convention. That convention had been signed by Germany as well, and the United States took its obligations seriously. The War Department saw humane treatment not as charity, but as strategy. If American POWs in German hands were to have any chance of decent care, the U.S. had to lead by example. But there was another reason, an unspoken one. American commanders understood that every interaction was psychological warfare. Feeding the enemy well, treating him fairly, showing discipline, these things sent a quiet message: we can afford to be generous because we have already won. For many Germans, the shock began the moment they stepped off the train. The guards didn't curse them. They didn't strike them. They didn't even seem angry. Instead, they offered water, food, and cigarettes. Some guards even shared small talk, asking about families or the weather in Germany. It wasn't weakness, it was confidence. Daily life inside the camps reflected that same order. Prisoners worked in fields, factories, or sawmills, often side by side with American civilians. They earned small wages in camp currency they could spend on comforts: soap, tobacco, or stationery for letters home. Music drifted from the barracks in the evenings. Some camps even held concerts and theater plays, with POWs performing for one another. The Red Cross inspected regularly, ensuring compliance. Meals were balanced and sufficient, often better than what American troops on the front lines were eating. When coffee, chocolate, or cigarettes appeared, it wasn't a rare luxury. It was part of the system. The prisoners couldn't understand it. Many had believed the Allied nations to be barbaric or corrupt. Now they were sitting under a wide American sky, holding hot coffee poured by the very soldiers they'd been taught to hate. And behind that confusion, a quiet respect began to form. In time, that respect would turn to reflection, forcing many to question what kind of world they had been fighting for. Across America, the prisoner camps blended almost seamlessly into the landscape. From the air, they looked like small rural towns. Rows of barracks, guard towers at the corners, neat dirt roads cutting between them. Most were surrounded not by fear but by curiosity. Local newspapers wrote stories about the enemy soldiers now living among them, and many small-town Americans, after initial unease, came to see the prisoners as workers more than threats. By 1944, German POWs were laboring in hundreds of communities, harvesting wheat in Kansas, cutting timber in Oregon, picking fruit in California, and working in sawmills and canneries in the South. With so many American men overseas, the country needed labor, and the War Department saw the prisoners as part of the solution. The arrangement benefited everyone. The government saved money, local farmers got help, and the POWs earned privileges through honest work. Each day began with the same routine: roll call, breakfast, work details. Guards stood watch but rarely interfered. In many camps, discipline was self-regulated. German officers maintained internal order, and those who tried to escape were swiftly caught but seldom harmed. The system functioned because it was built on predictability and calm, not cruelty. What astonished the prisoners most was the scale of American abundance. Food was plentiful, rations generous. They were given bread, meat, potatoes, coffee, and sometimes extras like chocolate or fruit. Cigarettes were distributed regularly, often the same brands smoked by U.S. soldiers. For men who had grown up under wartime rationing, and who had watched Germany burn under Allied bombers, this level of comfort felt unreal. One prisoner later recalled that the first time he saw an American mess hall, he thought it was a trick, an illusion meant to demoralize them. But it wasn't. The Americans were simply living as they always had, confident, organized, and prosperous even in the middle of a world war. Letters sent home reflected the shock. Many prisoners wrote cautiously, aware that German censors might read their mail. Still, the tone was unmistakable. They described well-built camps, decent guards, fair treatment. Some wrote that they were being fed so well they had gained weight. A few even expressed guilt, knowing their families back home were surviving on scraps. This contrast, between the hunger and fear in Germany and the relative calm in America, began to erode propaganda illusions. Prisoners who had believed the United States to be decadent or morally weak now saw discipline and efficiency at every level. American guards followed rules without hatred. Civilians treated them with restrained decency. When trucks carrying POWs passed through small towns, children sometimes waved. Occasionally, church groups sent gifts or invited them to Christmas services. In a war defined by destruction, these small acts of normalcy were disarming. The prisoners started to compare not just armies but societies. They saw a nation where freedom and wealth were not contradictions, where strength came from stability, not fear. For the Americans, too, the experience was revealing. Many guards had lost friends overseas. Some had fought in North Africa or Italy before being reassigned to POW duty. Yet most carried out their tasks with professionalism. They understood that how they treated the enemy said something about who they were as a country. Over time, life in the camps became strangely ordinary. Gardens were planted, soccer tournaments were organized, choirs and orchestras formed from the ranks of captured soldiers. The barbed wire remained, but inside it, the routines of humanity returned. For the Germans, that was the real shock. Not the coffee or the chocolate, but the idea that war could coexist with decency. And that realization, quiet but powerful, would shape the next phase of their captivity, when curiosity turned to reflection and reflection to change. When the first German prisoners arrived in America, they were still soldiers of the Reich in their own minds. Defeated, yes, but not broken. Many had expected the worst: beatings, starvation, public humiliation. The propaganda they'd grown up with had painted Americans as materialistic and ruthless. Yet their first encounters shattered that image. At Camp Swift in Texas, several prisoners later recalled how an American guard, seeing a captured sergeant struggling with a heavy duffel, helped him carry it inside. At another camp in Iowa, newly arrived men were given new clothes, hot meals, and medical checks. The first instinct of many was suspicion. They thought it was psychological warfare or a trick to soften them before interrogation. But days passed and the treatment didn't change. There were strict rules, of course: curfews, roll calls, and punishments for misbehavior. But the tone was disciplined, not vengeful. The guards didn't curse them. They didn't force propaganda down their throats. The difference was quiet but profound. It was a form of victory the Germans had never experienced before. Moral authority. Slowly, the disbelief gave way to a kind of gratitude. Prisoners began to realize they weren't being treated as monsters, but as men who had lost. They were still enemies, but enemies who deserved dignity. For some, that respect felt heavier than punishment. One former prisoner later said that the first time an American officer saluted him, acknowledging his rank under the Geneva Convention, he felt shame rather than pride. In his words, "They treated us better than we had treated our own people." This emotional shift, from fear to reflection, became the invisible victory that America never celebrated publicly, but achieved nonetheless. Behind the kindness was not naivete, but calculation. The U.S. Army knew that how it treated German prisoners would echo far beyond the camps. Humane treatment served multiple purposes: moral, political, and military. The most obvious was reciprocity. Thousands of American airmen were being held in German camps like Stalag Luft III. Washington understood that word of fair treatment would travel, through Red Cross inspectors, letters, and returning prisoners. If America showed restraint, perhaps its own men would benefit in return. But there was also a deeper motive: control. Discipline was easier to maintain when prisoners felt respected. Food, coffee, and cigarettes weren't just comforts, they were tools of stability. A man with a full stomach and something to occupy his hands is less likely to rebel. At the same time, the American approach became a quiet weapon of persuasion. German officers who cooperated were given small privileges. Those who refused found their influence fading as ordinary soldiers began to see the contrast between Nazi promises and American reality. Without shouting a word of propaganda, the United States was waging psychological warfare through decency. The War Department even encouraged limited contact with local civilians. Farmers who hired POW labor often spoke of how surprised they were by the men's politeness and skill. For many Germans, this mutual respect became their first direct exposure to democracy in action, not through lectures but through ordinary life. By 1945, reports from within the camps noted that morale among prisoners was high, discipline stable, and escape attempts minimal. The humane system worked, not because it was soft, but because it was structured. The Americans weren't trying to win affection. They were proving a point. A free nation could fight fiercely and still remain civilized. The cigarettes, the coffee, and the chocolate weren't luxuries in the moral sense. They were statements of confidence, proof that America didn't need cruelty to show strength. That lesson was not lost on the men behind the wire, and it would deepen as the months passed when the reality of Nazi defeat collided with the quiet order of their new lives. For many captured Germans, the hardest part of captivity wasn't the loss of freedom, it was the loss of certainty. They had marched under banners promising glory, believing Germany was destined to rule through discipline, order, and racial superiority. Yet, in the heart of their enemy's land, they found all those same qualities, only better organized, fairer, and more humane. This realization struck deep. Prisoners who once viewed America as culturally inferior began to see the opposite. The guards who offered them cigarettes and hot meals weren't weak. They were disciplined in a way that required no ideology to sustain it. Their confidence came from abundance, not fear. Psychologists later studied letters and diaries smuggled from POW camps and found a recurring theme: confusion mixed with admiration. "We thought they were soft," one former Wehrmacht officer wrote. "But they have everything: machines, food, music, and they are kind." For men raised under authoritarian propaganda, this environment caused quiet internal conflict. Some began debating politics at night, arguing whether the war had been a colossal mistake. Others fell silent, too ashamed to speak of the Reich. And a few, usually younger soldiers, found themselves genuinely inspired by what they saw, not just America's material wealth, but its sense of fairness. Camp newspapers, permitted by us. Officials became spaces for reflection. Articles written by POWs discussed freedom, justice, and reconstruction. The Americans encouraged it, understanding that moral change couldn't be forced and it had to be witnessed. In a way, each cup of coffee, each shared cigarette was part of that education. For the first time, many Germans realized that the power they had been fighting against wasn't barbarism dressed in industrial might. It was civilization, multiplied by freedom. Beyond the barbed wire, a larger revelation unfolded: the cultural shock of America itself. Many POWs expected a hard, militarized country defined by factories and soldiers. What they saw instead was a society humming with life. Families, schools, radio shows, baseball games, grocery stores bursting with food even in wartime. From their work assignments, prisoners glimpsed this world firsthand. They saw young American women driving tractors, old men running local stores, and school children waving flags without fear. They saw a country at war yet not consumed by it. To men who came from a Europe of ruins, this was staggering. Some POWs were even allowed to listen to local radio or watch films shown in camp recreation halls. American music fascinated them: swing, jazz, the cheerful optimism of popular songs. For a generation raised on martial marches and propaganda, this joy felt alien but magnetic. The cultural gap widened when they received packages from the Red Cross: soap that smelled of fruit, toothpaste with mint, even illustrated magazines. Small items, yet each one symbolized a level of comfort that wartime Germany couldn't imagine. The Americans weren't flaunting wealth. They were revealing normalcy. That, more than anything, humbled the prisoners. They realized that the enemy's strength came not from domination, but from stability, from a society that allowed prosperity without oppression. This cultural exposure had long-term consequences. After the war, when many POWs returned to a shattered homeland, they carried fragments of America with them: the taste of coffee, the sound of swing music, the memory of fair treatment. For some, these memories became seeds of change in post-war Germany's democratic rebirth. In the end, what the Germans encountered behind the wire wasn't just an enemy nation. It was an idea that strength and compassion could coexist. And soon as the war turned toward its final years, that idea would reach its most striking moment, when the prisoners realized they were witnessing not just their own defeat, but the triumph of a different kind of power. By 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. The once proud Wehrmacht was retreating on every front. For the hundreds of thousands of Germans already behind American barbed wire, news of that collapse arrived in fragments: Red Cross bulletins, overheard radio broadcasts, or whispered rumors from newly arrived prisoners. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, a young sergeant named Friedrich couldn't believe what he read. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. At Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, officers debated whether Berlin could still hold. By spring, the truth was unavoidable. The Reich was finished. Yet outside their barracks, the American guards carried on as always, calm and unhurried, offering the same morning coffee, the same small courtesies. The contrast was painful. That spring, something shifted inside the camps. The defiance that once hung in the air began to fade. The guards noticed it first: fewer salutes to imaginary flags, fewer heated political arguments. The camp orchestras played softer tunes. When the evening roll call ended, prisoners lingered in silence, staring through the wire as if seeing the world differently. One morning at a camp in Texas, a convoy of trucks arrived carrying supplies. Among them were boxes of chocolate, cigarettes, and canned fruit. A shipment originally meant for U.S. troops returning from Europe. Instead, the camp commander ordered it distributed to the prisoners. The guards, some barely older than the captives, carried the crates through the yard, handing out the goods without ceremony. The Germans stood stunned. It was the same disbelief they had felt on the day of arrival, only now it cut deeper. They had lost everything: their country, their leaders, their pride. And yet here was their enemy, victorious and still generous. No taunts, no humiliation, just quiet efficiency and an odd sense of respect. A former Luftwaffe mechanic later recalled, "When they gave us chocolate, I could not hold it. My hands trembled. It was as if my own war had finally ended." The moment spread like a whisper across the camps. Men who had refused to speak to Americans before now offered cautious thanks. Guards who had kept their distance began to exchange small jokes or cigarettes. The boundary between victor and vanquished softened, not in rules but in humanity. This was not sentimentality. The Americans were following orders and principles. But to the Germans it felt like something profound, a glimpse of the civilization their leaders had promised to destroy. They began to realize that mercy, too, could be a weapon, one far stronger than fear. Letters from prisoners captured the feeling. They have defeated us not with hatred but with calm. I think they wanted to show us what kind of men they are. For many, that calmness was unbearable. Some senior officers turned bitter, warning younger men not to be seduced by American kindness. But for the majority, the war's emotional center had already shifted. The Americans had achieved something propaganda never could. They had turned the enemy's admiration into quiet surrender. As the last weeks of the European war played out, radios in the camps buzzed with reports of Hitler's death, the fall of Berlin, and Germany's unconditional surrender. The prisoners stood in stunned silence. Some wept openly. Others simply stared at the horizon. And then, almost symbolically, the camp kitchens began serving something new: coffee, chocolate, and cigarettes, rationed now for everyone, including the guards. There were no cheers, no celebrations, just men, once enemies, sitting on wooden benches, sharing small comforts under the same fading sky. In that simple, almost domestic peace, the most decisive victory of all had already occurred. It was the moment the German prisoners finally understood. They had lost the war long before their surrender, the day they mistook brutality for strength. As the summer of 1945 arrived, the POW camps across America no longer felt like holding pens for the defeated. They had become small functioning societies, places where former enemies farmed, studied, and quietly redefined themselves. In one camp in Georgia, the prisoners built a chapel out of scrap lumber. In another, in Kansas, they started a small orchestra that played Beethoven on Sunday afternoons for both guards and locals. The same men who once marched beneath the swastika were now performing music in a land they had been taught to hate. The locals, at first suspicious, began to change too. Farmers realized the German laborers sent to help in the fields were polite, hardworking, and grateful for fair pay. Children who had never seen a real German before would ride their bikes to the camp fence and trade candy for hand-carved toys. Over time, the word enemy started to lose its weight. Not everyone approved. Some Americans had lost brothers and sons in Europe. For them, seeing these same men laughing in the sunlight or sipping coffee under shade trees felt wrong, almost obscene. But others saw something different, a quiet proof that America could win without hatred. One camp commandant described it perfectly. If we treat them like animals, we become what we fought against. But if we treat them like men, we remind them what they forgot to be. Inside the camps, education programs began. English lessons, civics courses, even discussions about democracy. The U.S. Army believed re-education could help rebuild Germany after the war. Some prisoners resisted, but many were curious. They debated freely, something unthinkable back home. For the first time, they could speak without fear of the Gestapo or party spies. Friedrich, the young sergeant from Camp McCoy, attended those sessions. He later wrote in his diary, "They do not force us to agree. They only ask that we think. It feels new." And then came the moment no one had prepared for. News that some prisoners might soon be sent home. The announcement brought mixed feelings. Many were desperate to return. Others were terrified. What waited for them in the ruins of Germany? Cities burned, families displaced, a nation in shame. They had left as soldiers. They would return as symbols of defeat. Yet the thought of leaving behind a place where they had been treated with dignity filled them with an odd sadness. When the first transport trucks rolled out, entire camps gathered to watch. American guards and German prisoners shook hands through the barbed wire. Some exchanged photos, addresses, even small gifts. A cigarette case, a harmonica, a carved wooden cross. A U.S. private remembered one moment vividly. One of them pressed something into my hand, a chocolate wrapper folded neatly around a note. It said, "You taught me more with kindness than my leaders did with fear." For the Americans, it was a small gesture. For the Germans, it was a quiet absolution. Those who returned to Europe carried more than memories. They carried a different image of America, not as conquerors, but as a nation that could fight fiercely and still show restraint. In the years after the war, that image mattered more than any bomb or bullet. Historians would later call it the moral victory, a subtle but decisive influence on how post-war Germany viewed the West. Many of those former POWs would go on to rebuild their country with a sense of fairness they first experienced behind American fences. What began with a cup of coffee and a bar of chocolate had become something far greater, a quiet revolution in conscience. And when the last camp gates finally closed, there were no cheers, no parades, just a lingering sense that something deeply human had happened in those forgotten fields of America. The war had ended, but the lesson would endure. By the end of 1946, most German prisoners of war held in the United States had been repatriated. More than 370,000 had crossed the Atlantic during the war, a staggering number that turned the American heartland into an unseen world of guarded villages and fenced farms. Yet when they departed, they left behind something invisible but lasting, a story of mercy amid total war. The American government had followed the Geneva Convention closely. Prisoners were fed the same rations as U.S. soldiers. They had access to medical care, mail, and even recreation. They worked in agriculture, lumber mills, and factories, but were paid for it in camp credits or small wages. In return, they helped keep the wartime economy alive while millions of Americans fought overseas. When they boarded ships home, many carried Red Cross parcels filled with gifts, tins of coffee, packs of cigarettes, candy bars, letters from local children. To outsiders, these were trivial comforts, but to men who had once endured the hunger of Stalingrad or the frost of the Ardennes, they were priceless. The contrast between their treatment in America and the fate of German POWs held by the Soviets was striking. In Soviet labor camps, hundreds of thousands perished from starvation, exposure, and disease. For those who had survived the American system, the difference was unforgettable. It became one of the earliest moral dividing lines of the post-war world and a subtle but powerful preview of the ideological contest that would soon define the Cold War. Historians have often pointed out how this approach paid unexpected dividends. The United States had shown not only its military power, but also its moral restraint. Many of the returned prisoners became witnesses, informal ambassadors for democracy. They spoke about the strange decency of their captors, the organized fairness of the camps, the humanity that existed even in victory. In interviews decades later, former POWs recalled how the experience changed them. One, who later became a schoolteacher in West Germany, said, "They did not humiliate us. They could have, but they didn't. That taught me something about what freedom really means." Another wrote to a farmer in Texas who had hired him during the war, thanking him for his kindness and sending a photo of his rebuilt home in Bavaria. Such letters continued for years, bridging oceans and memories. American communities, too, felt the echo. Many locals remembered those years with surprising warmth. Towns that had once been wary of the enemy now spoke of the Germans who played music, built furniture, or helped bring in the harvest. The experience softened both sides, a reminder that even in total war, not every encounter was defined by hatred. By the late 1940s, as the world shifted from global conflict to geopolitical rivalry, these stories faded from public memory. The POW camps were dismantled, their fences torn down, the land returned to farming or industry. Only a few concrete foundations remained, silent traces of an extraordinary chapter in wartime humanity. Yet for those who lived through it, the memory was sharp. They had witnessed the rarest kind of victory, a moral one. The kind that didn't depend on destruction but on restraint. And it all began not with a speech or treaty, but with small acts. A cup of hot coffee, a cigarette passed through a wire fence, a chocolate bar shared with a man who no longer had a country. When the last transports departed American shores, the German prisoners looked back at a country that had treated them with a curious mixture of strength and compassion. They had entered as enemies of democracy, indoctrinated, suspicious, sometimes defiant, and left with an image of America that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had told them. For many, the shock of that realization was deeper than defeat on the battlefield. In Germany, they had been told that Allied captivity meant torture or death. Instead, they found baseball fields, libraries, clean barracks, and hot meals. Guards spoke to them without hatred. Even discipline, strict as it was, came with fairness, not vengeance. A former Wehrmacht lieutenant later said in a 1975 interview, "It was the first time I understood what real order looked like. Not fear-based, but respected. The Americans didn't need to shout to be obeyed." The American camp system had not been perfect. There were incidents of escape attempts, a few cases of violence and internal tensions between die-hard Nazis and ordinary soldiers. But overall, it functioned with a discipline that reflected a broader American ideal, that victory should not corrupt humanity. In 1947, as ships carried the last groups of prisoners back to Bremerhaven, German newspapers began publishing accounts from returnees. Some were hesitant to speak, fearing they would be accused of sympathy for the enemy. Others wrote openly, describing the surreal decency of their captors. These accounts quietly shaped public perception in post-war Germany. It is estimated that over 5,000 former German POWs later emigrated to the United States or Canada, drawn by the memory of what they had seen in captivity. A few married American women who had worked in or near the camps. Others named their children after towns where they had once been held. The psychological effect on the German population was subtle but real. The stories of the POWs, combined with the Marshall Plan's generosity, built the first foundations of trust between former enemies. The United States, which had once bombed their cities, now appeared as a nation capable of rebuilding them, and of forgiving without forgetting. Meanwhile, within the American military, the success of the POW program became a model for future conflicts. Manuals written for handling Axis prisoners influenced how later wars, from Korea to Vietnam, managed enemy combatants. The lesson was simple but profound. Discipline and decency could coexist. In the small American towns that had hosted these camps, life eventually returned to normal. Barbed wire was pulled down, guard towers dismantled. Corn grew again where watchtowers once stood. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, a farmer might still find a rusted spoon or a name carved into an old wooden beam, a small trace of men who had once been called enemies. By the 1980s, many of those POWs were old men. Some revisited the towns where they had been held. Local newspapers captured those reunions. Photographs of gray-haired former soldiers shaking hands with equally aged American farmers. Smiles, handshakes, sometimes tears. A generation closing a circle. One American veteran who had guarded a camp in Louisiana said simply, "We beat them in war, but we won something bigger in peace." That sentiment captures the heart of the story. The treatment of German POWs in America was not just about morality or the Geneva Convention. It was a deliberate reflection of who the United States wanted to be in victory, a nation powerful enough to show mercy. The coffee, the cigarettes, the chocolate, they were small gestures. But to men who had known the brutality of the Eastern Front or the hunger of retreat, they meant civilization itself. And in those quiet, everyday acts, America revealed its truest weapon, not a tank, not a bomber, but the quiet strength of character that endures long after the guns fall silent. History often remembers the noise, the roar of engines, the thunder of artillery, the clash of empires. But sometimes what endures is the silence that follows and what men do with it. The story of the German POWs in America is one of those quiet legacies. It wasn't written in victory parades or on battlefield maps, but in the ordinary gestures of humanity that happened far from the front lines, in coffee shared on a cold morning, in cigarettes passed between men who no longer needed to hate, in the faint laughter of soldiers realizing they had survived, and that survival itself was now the only side worth being on. America had proven its industrial power through bombers and tanks, but here, it proved something deeper. That strength without cruelty could win hearts as well as wars. That even an enemy treated with dignity might one day become a friend. For the Germans, those months behind wire were a strange education. They saw a country that worked, a society built on freedom rather than fear. It was not perfect, but it was real, and it would stay with them long after they returned to the ruins of their homeland. In that sense, the POW camps became quiet classrooms of democracy, not through lectures but through example. The war had begun as a contest of weapons. It ended in places like these as a contest of character. And in that final measure, coffee, chocolate, cigarettes, the United States showed that the most enduring form of victory is not dominance, but decency.